Hello, today we're going to talk about how to create a custom hook. We're going to be creating a countdown for our math quiz game. And that countdown is going to be the perfect opportunity to also look into how useEffect work and how useRef works. And we're also going to be taking a slight detour through JavaScript timer functions and closures. So let's get cracking. So what do we have and what do we want to have? We have our math quiz that poses a simple question. What is, say, 7 plus 3? And then it proposes 4 answers, 10, 11, 12, 13. And the player, for the moment, has all the time in his life. But there's no pressure, there's no thrill of being able to answer within the timing before it runs out. And so the idea is to say, okay, you now have 10 seconds left, 9 seconds left, 8 seconds left, 6 seconds left. Maybe there's 7 seconds. Anyway, so to do that, we're going to be creating our countdown. And to do that, we need to look at how timers work in JavaScript. Now there are 2 functions, basically. There's setTimeout and setInterval. setTimeout allows us to call a function after a certain delay. setInterval allows us also to call a function after a certain delay, but then to call it again once that delay is passed again, and then again, and then again. So for our ticking clock, setInterval is the perfect match. What's important to note also is that both of these functions have a delay variable, which allows us to specify how much time should pass before we call the function, and that delay is expressed in milliseconds. So for our ticking seconds, we're going to have a delay of 1,000. 1,000 milliseconds is 1 second. Another thing to note is that we need to make sure we clean up after ourselves and that we clear the timer. So for an interval timer, it's clear interval timer. For a timeout, it's clear timeout. Now the basic timer will have a logic which runs along something like this. We have initial value for the counter, and then we have the set interval which decreases the counter every second. When the counter reaches 0, then we clear up the interval and trigger the next question. That's the basic logic, but how does it work in a React component? Well, let's start by just wrapping that code inside a React component and see what happens. We have our counter, which will use as state. So we have a use state 10 and have the counter and the set counter in there. And then we just have our timer and our set interval, which updates the state every second. And when the state is equal to 0, we clear the timer. And then we have the return, which displays the value of the counter and which states that it's done when the counter reaches 0. Don't copy and paste this code. Don't use it. It's very dangerous. We end up with an exponential number of timers. Now, why is that? The timer is created every time a render is called. And the render is called every time the state is updated. So first we start off with the timer. After a second, we have the state that is updated. So a second timer is created because the render is rerun. As a second timer is created, this will also, after a second, change the state. And the other timer that already exists also changes the state. So we now have 2 functions that are running and that change the state. And they each create a new one. And so we end up with 2, with 4, with 8, with 16, with 32, with 64, with 128, 256 and so on. It's a good way to crash a computer. It's not a good way to code. Thankfully, there's a hook for that. Now, what is that hook? That hook is obviously useEffect, because this is typically a side effect. And the way we set up useEffect so that it only runs once and it creates the timer once is to pass in an array of empty dependencies. We pass in an empty table. So our useEffect function that we've wrapped around our interval code will only run once when the component is created. So far so good. So we add in all our content in there. We clear up the interval when the counter is equal to 0, and we set the state inside our timer. Another point, we clean up after ourselves as the return function of the useEffect. Now, this is the cleanup function. It's the function which is used to clean up the effects of the side effect. This function is called if it is returned, not after the effect is run, but before the next effect is run and before the component is unmounted. Now what happens? It doesn't work. The timer only moves once. Now why is that? If we add a log function inside the timeout, inside the setInterval, we can see that that function is called every second. However, the counter, the value of the state, is not updated. Now the reason for this is both simple and complicated. Basically, useEffect and setInterval call closures. A closure is a function that captures its environment. It captures the value of the scope that's around it. So it's able to read the value of the counter, even though it's not defined within the function. But the value that it reads is the value that is set when the closure is created. And that closure is created when? It's created when useEffect is run, initially. So counter, the value of counter is captured and is always worth 10 inside the timer. And so the timer keeps calling set counter 10 minus 1, set counter 10 minus 1. And so it keeps calling, but it doesn't change. And what we need is a way to pass in initially an object which will reference the changing state. Thankfully, there's also a hook for that. That hook is useRef, use reference. It allows us to create a stable JavaScript object which stays the same throughout the lifecycle of the component. We can then set a field inside that object to reference the changing state, the counter. As that object has been created right from the start and stayed the same, it's included inside the environment captured by the closure, which means that we can use the value of the field to check if the timer has reached 0 and also to update the counter. What happens? It works. Cool, no? Well, okay, I find it cool. Now, it's a nice first step, but we wanted to create a custom hook, at least I wanted to. I want to have this code, I want to be able to reuse it in other places. So to do that, what I need to do is to be able to pass in the initial value that I want. I don't want it to always be 10, might want it to be 30 if I want to have an easier timeout, and might want it to be 5 if I want to make it. I want to pass in an action that can be called when the timeout is complete. And I want to be able to pass in dependencies that re-trigger the timer and restart it. I want to be able to have the value of the counter to be able to display it, and I want to be able to stop the counter when the quiz is finished, when I no longer need the timer. So before we go into that though, what is a custom hook? Well, let's look at our code here. Let's take all this code, all this logic that manages the timeout, the countdown, and let's wrap it in a function. Let's create a function called useCountdown, which simply returns all that logic. And that, my friends, is a custom hook. A custom hook is a function that wraps other hooks. Pretty simple. This means that our component is now reduced to this. We have counter equals useCountdown and we're good to go. But we wanted to take this slightly further, and we had a set of requirements, and we can now meet these requirements. We want to set in the initial value, and so when we add in the initial value, we set the state to that initial value. We also want to be able to have an onComplete action which triggers when the timer reaches 0. And so line 14, when the counter reaches 0, we trigger onComplete. We also want to be able to have values that we watch and that we use to re-trigger the useEffect hook. As you can see, line 4 we pass in the values, and line 22 we add them to the useEffect. Now, if we want this useEffect to actually re-trigger the countdown, we need to add in a function which resets the counter to the initial value that's been passed in as a variable. Now we also want to be able to return a way to stop the timer. And to do that, we start by creating a state to store the timer inside. And we store this timer when useEffect is triggered. Then we create a function which clears the interval, and we return that function as the return of our hook. And voila, we've created a custom hook that does a countdown. Okay, well, that's us done. I had fun. I hope you did too. If you found value in this video, if you had fun, please like the video, and you can even subscribe if you want, but that's up to you. If you have any questions, if you have any comments, if you have any suggestions, leave them in the comments. That's what they're there for. And I'll see you in the next video. Bye.